Welcome to the Patrick Coffin Show. All you C.S. Lewis nerds out there, get your C.S. Lewis on. We're going to have a lot of fun. We're going to learn a ton about Clive Staples Lewis, who died on the same day, as some of you may know, as President John F. Kennedy and Aldous Huxley. Peter Crave wrote a book about this called Between Heaven and Hell. Today, we're going to range along and across the life of C.S. Lewis, particularly the Chronicles of Narnia, and what I think is a magic code that has been cracked that unlocks an entire new set of dimensions for the septet written by C.S. Lewis, the Chronicles of Narnia, right here on The Patrick Coffin Show. Yes, indeed. Our guest is Dr. Michael Ward, Senior Research Fellow at Blackfriars Hall at the University of Oxford and Professor of Apologetics at Houston Baptist University. His main area of research is theological imagination, particularly in the works of C.S. Lewis. And today we're going to dig deep, or rather, to make the metaphor better, fly far to planet Narnia, which is the title of an absolutely fascinating book about the seven heavens in the imagination of C.S. Lewis. Michael Ward, so glad to have you aboard.
Thank you for welcoming me onto your spacecraft, Patrick.
I'm reading the Chronicles to my now 12-year-old daughter as we tape the show, and when I was reading the chapter on Jupiter, of course, your thesis began to emerge in the reading of it. I read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe when I was a teenager, maybe too young to understand what was going on with the story, and I thought the movies were okay. I thought the first one was better, but. Yeah. Let's start with like 5,000 feet above the tarmac a little bit. When did you become interested in the works of C.S. Lewis?
When I was about 5 or 6, when my parents read the Narnia books to me and to my two older brothers when we were young. We would jump into our parents' bed on a Sunday morning, and my mum would read us the latest chapter of the latest Chronicle before we had breakfast and went off to church.
Did you read The Magician's Nephew first?
No. And I'm very glad I didn't, because it is not the book to start with. You must start with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And do not be led astray by evil publishers who put a whacking great number 1 on The Magician's Nephew. It doesn't work as the first opener of the series.
Now, I wish you would commit to an opinion, Michael. Just get off the fence, okay? Why do you think C.S. Lewis wrote those books at all? Was it in reaction to, you allude to this in the book, the famous meeting with Elizabeth Anscombe, the Catholic philosopher, who debated or had a discussion relative to C.S. Lewis's book on miracles, and the popular canard possibly is that C.S. Lewis was so wounded and so broken by this that he reverted into kitty lit away from the deep end of the pool. How much truth is there in that?
None.
Okay, well.
It's a ridiculous notion. It's ridiculous on 2 counts. One, Lewis did not retreat from philosophical apologetics. In fact, he respected Elizabeth Anscombe's critique sufficiently that he rewrote Miracles, taking into account what she had said. He revised chapter 3, which she had found fault with, and she later commented that this reflected his honesty and seriousness as a philosopher. So he didn't retreat from philosophical apologetics, and neither did he take refuge in kiddie-lit, because as far as Lewis was concerned, the imaginative approach, the poetic, symbolic way of speaking, was actually a deeper, maturer, richer way of conveying spiritual truths than philosophical abstractions. So by turning to fairy tale, Lewis was actually, I think, advancing into a higher and deeper, if that's not a contradiction in terms, it's higher and deeper at once. It's generally bigger mode of communication.
Does this go to this notion of kappa, or this hiddenness of imagination, where it's the ethos? You go to great lengths, and you've got magnificent synonyms for this idea of hiddenness, the tone, the flavor, the atmosphere, and so on. Certainly, book sales have not diminished since his life came to an end here below in 1963. Do you think that's the key? In addition to the Planet Narnia key, which we'll get to, but the idea of conveying truth through story in a non-discursive, more imaginative way had a greater impact, apparently.
Yeah, absolutely. It's poets who are the unacknowledged legislators of every age, That is to say, it is people who give us ways of thinking and ways of speaking, who craft metaphors and overall paradigms. It is they who are the unacknowledged legislators in every age, because it's those ways of speaking and thinking, those controlling metaphors, that people fall into without even realizing it, that shape their whole worldview. It's like the spectacles. It's like, well, not even the spectacles. It's like your own eyesight that you're not aware of. It's through which you understand your whole world. And so, yes, I think Lewis's respect for storytelling, for the imaginative approach of fairy tale and science fiction and myth, does account for why he's still incredibly widely read, even nearly 60 years after his death.
You point out that there was a kind of coy, non-disclosing aspect to his personality. He revealed a lot. He was very forthright and not. He wasn't a liar, but he was also a kind of evasive as to the imaginative origins of what he was getting across. Did he ever disclose why he wrote the septet of the Chronicles of Narnia? Like why that? What was the genesis of it?
Yeah, he says some things in public about what motivated him and what he was trying to achieve. And, those things are all well known. He published articles in the Radio Times and in the New York Times explaining to a certain extent, what he was about. But he also says, interestingly, at one point, that you must not believe all that an author tells you about how they wrote their books. And I think that's significant. Of course, an author, any artist, will keep certain cards close to their chest, because the whole point of the art is that the art speaks for itself. If it has to be explained by the author, then there's no point in producing the novel or whatever it may be. So what I've tried to do in Planet Narnia is to get below his public utterances and get myself so embedded in his own mindset that I can see what he's doing, even though he won't tell us what he's doing.
Discuss for a moment the difference between looking at the beam of light and looking along the beam of light. That's an interesting insight.
That's from an article Lewis wrote called Meditation in a Tool Shed, where he pictures himself standing in the darkness of his tool shed, and he can see a beam of light slanting down through a crack in the top of the door, and he can see little particles of dust floating in the sunbeam. And this is what he calls looking at an experience when you're contemplating it from the outside, when you're adopting a kind of external perspective, when you're disinterested, when you're supposedly objective and neutral.
Right.
That's one way in which we know things. But then he shifts his position so that the beam of light is no longer falling on the floor, but now falling directly on his eyes. And then he sees something quite different. He doesn't see the tool shed. He doesn't even see the beam of light, because now he looks along the beam, and by looking along it, he sees the crack at the top of the door and the leaves on the tree waving in the wind outside, and millions of miles away he sees the sun itself. And this is his image of the other kind of consciousness that we have when we are inside an experience, when we are embracing it or allowing ourselves to be embraced by it. We're not holding it at arm's length. We're not trying to be detached. The whole point in this second way of knowing is that we are committed. We are inhabiting the experience. We are personally acquainted with the thing. We're not trying to get some sort of neutral, objective perspective. And so this distinction that he draws between what he calls contemplation on the one hand and enjoyment on the other is very similar, actually, to the distinction you get in many languages in the two verbs to know, like in Spanish, saber and connaître, or in French, savoir and connaître. Knowledge about something from the outside is one way in which we know things. Knowledge of something from the inside is another way. And Lewis's purpose in this essay is to really get us to encourage us to try out every question in both modes, insofar as that's possible. He says we should be like the ancient Persians who debated everything twice, once when they were sober and once when they were drunk.
Better than alive and dead or awake and asleep. Certainly more interesting and entertaining. Let's segue from the reflections in a tool shed to Sol, one of the traditional seven planets, seven orbs that really goes to the heart of the thesis of your book. Was that essay itself possibly a clue to the code that you have cracked?
What, this meditation in a tool shed essay?
Yes, and focusing on the sun, Saul.
Yeah. Sorry, for a moment I thought you said Saul, as in King Saul.
Oh no, not or Saul of Tarsus. No, maybe that's my Canadian accent, if there is one. Yeah, Saul, S-O-L.
Saul, S-O-L. Saul. Yes. Well, yeah. I mean, there's obviously a strong connection between the two things, between meditation in a tool shed and this idea of light illuminating us, and whatever he writes about the sun from the point of view of his expertise as a medieval literary critic. Mm-hmm. Because as a medieval historian, Lewis wrote a lot about the seven heavens, the seven planets of the old medieval cosmos, and one of these seven planets was indeed the sun. We don't think of the sun as a planet anymore, but until the time of Copernicus, it was one of the seven heavens. The sun, the moon, Mars, Mercury, Venus, Jupiter, and Saturn. Those were the seven heavens. Yeah.
One thing I noticed in reading your book, Planet Narnia, Michael, is the reaction or the sort of attitude that J.R.R. Tolkien had toward the Narnia series. He didn't think an awful lot of it. I'm sure he didn't despise it, but there was a kind of overtness that was against C.S. Tolkien's sensibilities. You discussed that at some length in the book. But what you've discovered, I think, would make Tolkien maybe roar with laughter at the things he missed. So let's get into it. What's the compressed version of the thesis of Planet Narnia with respect to the seven medieval planets as a kind of hermeneutical key to unlock a different dimension to the seven books? Because often people say, well, seven is probably sacraments there. Seven's a biblical number, and that's kind of case closed. Let's move on to something more interesting. What did you discover?
Well, C.S. Lewis described the seven heavens as spiritual symbols of permanent value, which were especially worthwhile in his own generation. Spiritual symbols. They symbolize the Spirit, not just the Holy Spirit, though they can be used for that, but the spirit of man, everything that we experience in one sense. And they are like a sevenfold spectrum of spiritual compartments, all the way from birth under Venus. Venus was associated with fertility and laughter and life-giving, all the way through from birth to death, symbolized by Saturn. Saturn was associated with death and disaster and old age and treachery, and everything in between. You get, it's rather like the seven ages of man in Shakespeare. You can fit all our experience into one or other of these seven compartments, and that's why Lewis liked them. He thought they were like archetypes. They were permanent features of the human imagination, and that's why he writes so extensively about them, not only in his academic works, like The Discarded Image, but also in his Ransom trilogy, which is full of planetary imagery taken from the Middle Ages, and in his poetry. And there's one particular long poem called The Planets that he wrote that gave me the idea about what he was up to in the Narnia Chronicles.
Was there a moment where light bulbs went off and scales fell from your eyes, or was it a gradual uncovering of this thesis of the backdrop? Because in reading the way you came to the conclusion reminded me of a saying of Marshall McLuhan. Not the medium is the message, but he talked about figure ground. So the figure is the print on the page, the ground is the paper, or nowadays the electronic surface of a screen, and both communicate something. You can't have figure actually without a ground. So this ground in what you've discovered is this sevenfold planetary configuration, which is a kind of a hidden meaning or a key.
Yeah, well, it was both sudden and very lengthy in discovering, because I'd been reading Narnia for about 30 years at the time I made this breakthrough, as I believe it to be. But I didn't see the breakthrough coming at all. It was pretty instantaneous, and it was a bit of a eureka moment. And it occurred when I was reading this long poem called The Planets, where Lewis is describing all the associations and all the qualities and attributes that they were thought to have in the Middle Ages. And when I get to the lines about Jupiter, the poem tells me that Jupiter brings about winter past and guilt forgiven.
Mm.
And it's those 5 words that leap off the page at me, winter past and guilt forgiven, and make me think of The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe.
Yes.
Which, of course, is all about, the passing of the White Witch's winter and the coming of Aslan's reign and the forgiving of Edmund's guilt.
Yes.
So that was the trigger that led me to associate the planets with the Chronicles in the first place. And so that was a very brief moment, but it had been steadily building up in me, as it were, for 3 decades, because I've been gradually getting more and more familiar with the Narnia Chronicles, more and more aware of their oddities, their seeming inconsistencies. And then suddenly the planets fall into my lap, so to speak, and so much suddenly makes perfect sense.
By Jove, you said. Now, I confess to not knowing the etymology of Jupiter, so this has been a linguistic treat for me reading through your book. Let's start with Jupiter and its identification, or its importance in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe specifically, and the connection between the symbolism of Jupiter and the notion of a lion and Aslan and kingliness. Mm.
Well, Jupiter was above all things associated with kingship in medieval thought, and that, incidentally, provides a connection back to miracles, where we started, the debate that Lewis had about his book Miracles with Elizabeth Anscombe, because in that book he's arguing for what he calls a monarchical conception of reality, that reality does not exist on just one plane, one sort of democratic flat level. Mm-hmm. No, we already in our natural selves have 2 levels. We have the body and we have the mind. And logic operating in a properly rational mind is of a different order. It's qualitatively or spiritually different from all other functions of the human body. It's different from a cough or a sneeze or an itch when we're thinking rational thoughts. So in our own natural selves, we already exist, Lewis argues, in a monarchical realm, in a monarchical
and hence hierarchical.
Hence hierarchical. And so I think what led Lewis to move from miracles to the Narnia Chronicles was his saying to himself, how can I put into symbolic or narrative or dramatic form this idea of a monarchical world? And I think his thought process went something like this. Monarchy, that's the world we live in. How can I put that into a story? Well, what do I associate with monarchy? I know Jupiter, because Jupiter is above all things the king in medieval thought. Mm-hmm. So he turns to the writing of a story in which joviality, Jupiterishness, so to speak, kingliness, is the inner meaning of the book. And that's symbolized throughout The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe in all sorts of ways. First of all, in Aslan himself, who is repeatedly described as the king of the wood, the king of the beasts. He's got a royal standard, a royal crown, a royal pavilion. Mm-hmm. He's got all these monarchical attributes. And indeed, he's the son of the emperor over the sea. So there's even more kingship above Aslan, as it were.
The father, so to speak.
The father, so to speak, yeah. But then it's not just the divine character who's depicted in kingly terms, it's the children too, because the children, when they first get into the wardrobe together, they put on the fur coats that they find there, and we're told that the fur coats looked more like royal robes than coats when they put them on. And that's an indication of where the story is going to finish up, when the children are actually crowned kings and queens. And Aslan says to them, once a king in Narnia, always a king in Narnia. Once a queen in Narnia, always a queen in Narnia. So there's all this kingly imagery everywhere you look.
Yeah, I never saw that before. Of course, too, furs in a wardrobe identify with Aslan's fur. It's almost like there's a foreshadowing of them sharing his nature, so to speak, in the furriness of the fur.
Yes, well, that's part of it. But I think the more sort of thoroughgoing symbol is kingship. And you see that even in the negative, even in the abused side of the symbol, because the witch, the White Witch, has declared herself Empress of Narnia, and she traps Edmund, not just with the Turkish delight, but with the promise of becoming the prince and later on the king after she is gone. And it's that promise of kingship that actually motivates Edmund's treachery. The Turkish delight is just the bait on the hook.
Have you encountered any feminist narrative that objects to the White Witch being a female, to kind of disrupting the charm and the goodness of the masculine figures?
Yes, of course. It's interesting, though, that kind of critique of negative depictions of female characters is never played the other way around. Nobody ever says Lewis was against men, because in The Magician's Nephew, Uncle Andrew is a bad man, or Shift the ape in the last battle is a male ape who is the Antichrist. And
the Bible uses the male masculine pronoun for the devil. No one complains about that.
Yes,
that's
right.
a good point. So obviously Jupiter is sort of the dominant planet, casting its light, if you will, on the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. What about the other six? How do they relate? I know it's a subtle thing. It's not, well, here's Mars and here's Saturn. It's not so overt. Yeah,
it's not overt, or else, it would have been spotted long before I noticed it. And the whole point is that it gets beneath our contemplative consciousness. We're not looking at it. We're looking along it, this symbolism. That's why it has escaped everybody's notice. But this, I'm sure, is Lewis's controlling sort of imaginative blueprint. And we'll come back, I hope, in a little bit to the theological significance of looking along. But for now, let me just list the other 6 books. Prince Caspian is the Mars story, all about warfare and, interestingly, woodland imagery. Mars was not always associated with warfare, but was originally a vegetation deity in Roman mythology, and he was called Mars Silvanus, and that's why you have all that stuff about the trees coming to the battle and Lucy trying to wake the trees and the Telmarines being frightened of the forests and so on. So Prince Caspian is the Mars book. The Voyage of the Dawn Treader is the Sun story, which you could guess really from the title. The Voyage of the Dawn Treader is the journey towards the place of the rising sun, and the book is full of gold imagery and light imagery, but also the slaying of dragons, because in Greek mythology, the sun god, the god of light, Apollo, was famously a slayer of dragons. We don't need to get into details of that, but those are some of the little tip-offs that signify this is the sun book, the solar story. The silver chair, again, you could guess that really from the title, because silver is associated with the moon. It's the moon's metal.
The silvery moon, right.
So, yeah, by the light of the silvery moon. And that book is full of wetness and wanderings and doubt and confusion and indeed lunacy, because Luna makes us lunatic. That's why the lost prince is found raving like a lunatic in the silver chair in the underworld kingdom.
There's some especially feminine dimension to the silver chair, in light of Luna being traditionally and linguistically feminine.
Well, yes,
Our Lady as the moon, so on.
He doesn't get into any Marian imagery in the silver chair, no, but yes, the moon is receptive. The moon receives the light of the sun. The moon has no light of its own. So the way Lewis uses that theologically in the silver chair is that Aslan is depicted as fully receptive to the higher light of the sun. So there is some gold in the silver chair, but it's not solar gold. It's it's lunar gold. It's the light of the sun shining on the lunar depicted Aslan. I can't summarize it very quickly. You need to read the relevant chapter of Planet Narnia, because it took me a long while to work out what Lewis was doing with the moon imagery in that book. But once you work it out, the silver chair is so much more brilliant as a work of art. You can really see what he's up to.
It's one of the lesser known ones, isn't it?
Yes, the first 3 are probably the best known. Though I do understand that the Silverchair is now being prepared for adaptation as a movie. They're in pre-production, I believe, for a
Really?
new feature film version of the Silverchair.
Well, in the beginning was the word. I hope the writer does it well. That's interesting.
Yeah, I think the screenwriter is the chap who adapted The Life of Pi,
Okay.
and that was a great movie adaptation, I thought. So that augurs well for the Silverchair.
Sure. What about Mars?
Mercury, you mean? Yeah,
Excuse
we've
me.
done Mars.
Mercury.
Mercury is the Horse and His Boy. That's even less well known than the Silverchair. And Mercury is associated with language, messages, running, boxing, theft, twins, quicksilver, and all those qualities, and many others besides, you will find in The Horse and His Boy. The Horse and His Boy makes beautiful sense when you understand it as a mercurial tale. I was absolutely dumbstruck when I turned up all this mercurial stuff. It makes such good sense of that book. Then the Venus story is The Magician's Nephew. Venus, as I mentioned, is all about fertility and life-giving and love and laughter, and that's why in The Magician's Nephew you have Narnia being brought to birth, you have the first joke, you have Diggory's mother being healed by a magic apple from a western garden, which is clearly modelled on the garden of the Hesperides, the garden of the western star. That's another name for Venus. So those are some of the Venus aspects of The Magician's Nephew, and the last battle is the Saturn story, because Saturn, as I mentioned, is associated with death and disaster, and in the last battle, all the characters die, and Narnia is brought to an end. And it's interesting that it's Father Time who brings Narnia to an end, because, as Lewis points out in his academic works, Father Time, with his scythe, his sickle, and his hourglass, is based on earlier pictures of Saturn. They're the same character, mythologically speaking. And in fact, when I was doing my researches, I discovered that Lewis, when he was preparing the Narnia Chronicles, originally called that character, Father Time, not Father Time, but the god Saturn. It's there in the draft.
Wow.
But he obviously thought that that was making it too obvious. So when he came to publish, he hid his purposes a little bit more carefully and called the character Father Time, banking on us not knowing that they are the same figure.
Was that surprising, the discovery of that draft? Because you point out that he typically trashed his drafts. He didn't save archives of what he had previously taken a shot at it.
Yeah, well, it was a surprise, and it was a great find, a great gift to me, actually, because I didn't turn it up myself, but my friend Walter Hooper, who was looking through this draft in the Bodleian Library here in Oxford, he wrote to me and said, "You'll be interested in this," because he knew what I was working on. And yeah, if there's any smoking gun, as it were, if there's any sort of clear documentary proof of what he was about, then I think this is it.
A smoking pipe, yes. For people who don't know who Walter Hooper is, he's a very important figure here.
Yeah, Walter Hooper was Lewis's secretary in the last few months of Lewis's life. And after Lewis died, Walter Hooper became one of the executors of Lewis's literary estate and has spent the last 5 decades and more editing all of Lewis's works and writing biographies and producing new editions of his poems and his letters and so on and so forth.
And
there's nobody who knows more about Lewis than Walter Hooper.
And Mr. Hooper became a Catholic later in life. I heard his testimony, very moving, interesting story involving St. John Paul II.
Yes.
One question I know my listeners will berate me if I don't ask you, and that is why, apart from being raised in Belfast, did C.S. Lewis not become Catholic in his life? Was there ever any interest in correspondence or anything that would incline him to become a member of the Tiber swim team?
No, there's no evidence that he was ever really close to swimming the Tiber. The warmest that he sounds about the Catholic Church is shortly after he became a Christian in adulthood, when he was in his early 30s. And in fact, one of the warm things he says about Catholic theology is in connection with the planets. He's writing to a friend talking about how he loves Dante's Divine Comedy. And of course, Dante in the Paradiso uses the seven heavens himself as a kind of ladder up which the pilgrim mounts in his ascent to God's throne. And Lewis thought that the Paradiso was the highest point poetry had ever reached. And he said that the endless sort of interplay of the orbs and the cycles and the epicycles of the planetary motions was like Catholic theology. The one radiated through the many. He loved it. But apart from that, he never speaks very warmly about Catholicism. Perhaps another example is when he's talking to some Anglican seminarians in later life, he says to them, "Woe to you if you preach not the gospel." If you don't preach the gospel, he said to them, one of two things will happen to your flock. Either they will become atheists or they will become Roman Catholics. Because he by that he meant that was complementary to the Catholic Church, because he was saying if Anglicans won't provide sound doctrine to their flocks, then those who want it will go where it is available, namely the Catholic Church.
Interesting. I had heard that attributed to Newman. I'm glad to know that was C.S. Lewis. If he were to come back teleport style today, do you think he'd be much more likely to identify with the Catholic faith than what has happened to the CV since the 60s and 50s?
Yes, probably. In one sense, I don't particularly like imagining these sorts of things, because it can, if we're not careful, come perilously close to judging other people's...
Or triumphalism.
Yeah, well, I mean, who are we to judge another's servant? Lewis served God according to his lights, and he did a marvelous job. So it's none of our business, really, what he did or what he might have done. Nonetheless, that said, I think you're right, that he would now be more inclined to become a Catholic than he was at the time of his death, because partly of what's happened to the Church of England, but partly also because of what's happened to the Catholic Church.
He certainly has been a magnet to Catholicism among many evangelicals who discover sacramentality and there's this notion of hierarchy and so on. There's obviously a rich Catholic resonance in much of what C.S. Lewis wrote. I know there's a gentleman named Lyman Stebbins who's the founder of a Catholic apostolate called Catholics United for the Faith. Their publisher published my book, Emmaus Road Publishing. And Mr. Stebbins had correspondence with C.S. Lewis. Perhaps you've read it. He's asking him, he's an Episcopalian, he's on Wall Street, and he writes to Lewis about his metaphor of the hallway in Mere Christianity. And their correspondence is published. And it was C.S. Lewis's answers to his questions that made him say, really, I have to become Catholic. He wasn't happy with it, with the metaphor of the presented in Mere Christianity, which I understand originally were talks over the BBC during the war. That's right. Yeah, they were 15-minute radio broadcasts, originally. How did C.S. Lewis die? Well, he had a long period of ill health in the year before his death. He had an enlarged. Do we need to get into all the medical details? I think the cause of death was heart failure. I see. Brought on by other problems. Yeah. How long before he died did Joy die, his wife? 3 years. 3 years. So Joy died in 1960 and Lewis died in 1963. But anyway, can I come back to your point about sacramentality? Yes, indeed. Because I think that is really what Lewis is up to in the Narnia Chronicles with his use of these 7 planetary symbols, because what he's doing is he's pervading each Narnia story with this spiritual symbol, so that the way Aslan is depicted, the way the children interact with Aslan, the way the background descriptions are put together, and all sorts of ornamental details, it's all keyed to the governing planetary symbol, so that the whole world of each Narnia Chronicle has a kind of pervasive tone or flavor or spirit, we might say, which you don't look at, you look along, you experience it from within. And this, for Lewis, was a very important theological truth, that when we come to know God, we can never look at God from a purely external spectator's point of view, because it's by God that we live and move and have our being. It's in God that we exist, that all things hold together.
So that's
Yeah.
what he's trying to do with these spiritual symbols. He's trying to give in fiction a sort of symbolic equivalent of a theological truth that he believes is so in the real world.
Mm-hmm.
And that's genius. That,
Yeah.
I think, is unprecedented. I don't know of any... I mean, lots of authors have tried to give a pervasive atmosphere to a story. That's nothing new. But what is new is the way Lewis connects the pervasive atmosphere with the Christ character,
Yes.
so that they both speak out of the same symbol, as it were.
Mm-hmm.
And that's brilliant. That's genius.
It reminds me of the atmospheric quality of the picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. It's suffused with something. I can't even put my finger on it. There's definitely I don't want to use the word aura. See, as soon as you begin to describe this, you start sounding like a New Age guru. That's the problem. You've used some words here that are going to expand my vocabulary, and I deliberately didn't look them up because I wanted to hear you explain what they mean, because I'm probably going to be stealing them or using them. Etiolated.
Oh, yeah.
What?
Yes.
To get etiolated, it sounds like too much beer. He got etiolated at the pub.
Etiolated is too little light.
Oh, that's great.
If you're pale, because you've been indoors too long, then you're etiolated or etiolated. Yeah.
Interesting. Is it E or et? What's the
I say et,
Yeah,
but I
etiolated.
don't.
Okay.
Never actually heard it said.
If your wife becomes valetudinarian, what is she becoming?
Well, valet, goodbye. So a valetudinarian is someone who's on the brink of saying goodbye.
Well, I didn't choose that on purpose. I wasn't thinking divorce.
I hope your wife is not proving to be
No.
valetudinarian.
That's great.
But it's not to do with divorce. It's to do with death and illness.
I
A
see.
valetudinarian is someone who's sick and chronically ill and is
I
always
see.
on the brink of
Always
death.
on the brink, right? One foot in the grave, the other on a banana peel.
Yeah.
Is that related etymologically to vale of death? Valley?
I don't know.
Estival or estival, Aestival?
Yeah. The opposite of well, to estivate is the opposite of to hibernate.
Oh, I see.
So to hibernate is associated with winter, and estivate is associated with the spring. So estival means pertaining to the spring, spring-like.
Right. Interesting. That's really goes to the heart of a lot of what happens in the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe.
Yes, exactly.
Thawing from winter.
It's where we get the word Easter from.
Oh, okay. Right. Interesting. I wanted to ask you about Donegality.
Yes.
It's a resonant word.
Yes.
Having the quality of Donegal, Ireland.
Yep. Donegal in Ireland was a place where Lewis liked to go on holiday. He went there many, many times in the course of his life. And in one of his academic works, he talks about, again, he's talking about atmosphere in literature. And he says that we go back and back to our favorite works of literature in the same way that we go back and back to our favorite destinations on holiday. We go back to Donegal for its Donegality, to London for its Londonness.
Yeah.
And these things, the spirit of a place is very difficult to put into words, but everybody knows it when they're there. So, given the value Lewis put upon Donegal as a holiday destination, and given the interesting nature of this word, Donegality, I thought I would use it myself. And I slightly reapply it. I talk about it not just in connection with the spirit of a place, nor even in connection with the spirit of a book, but with the precise spirit of the Narnia Chronicles, which, as I was just saying, is more than just a pervasive atmosphere. It's a Christologically focused pervasive atmosphere.
Yes. Yes, the backdrop that informs the foreground, if you will.
That's right.
You talk about music of the spheres. What you're describing in this Planet Narnia thesis reminds me of the definition of music, of circumventing the discursive thinking mind and somehow directly feeling, as it were, a connection between distant memories and so on. It all congeals, almost like literature is a synonym for music.
Yes, and that's indeed one of the favorite ways Lewis had of talking about the writing of fiction. He said that the images should always exist in every possible relationship of echo and contrast and repetition and half echo and variation. It's always the symphonic treatment of the images that counts in a well-told tale. And so what he's doing with the seven heavens is a kind of literary equivalent, I think, of what Gustav Holst did in his Planet Suite. Do you know the Planet Suite?
Not familiar. If I heard it, I might recognize it.
You would, I mean, think of this, the soundtrack to Star Wars.
Yep.
And you've got, I mean, John Williams there, he just completely ripped off Gustav Holst's Mars movement from the Planet Suite.
I'm going to put it in the show notes. Thank you for that. Yes.
Yeah. And Lewis loved the Planet Suite by Gustav Holst. He listened to it on many occasions, and he was greatly moved by it, I think. Well, I know, he says so.
Yeah.
What I think he was up to in the Narnia Chronicles is a kind of literary equivalent of the same thing, but this time with an interesting theological dimension going on at the same time.
Someone listening right now, Michael, who's very attached to astrology might think, well, C.S. Lewis believes that the placement of the planets affects your personality and future. How much did C.S. Lewis believe in astrology or sympathize with its one of its premises? Do you see what I'm asking?
Yep. He didn't believe in astrology in the way that people now use the word astrology. We now think of it in connection with either those silly horoscopes in the back pages of magazines. On Wednesday you will meet a rich and handsome stranger.
Yeah.
That's all nonsense. Lewis had no truck with that. And certainly he had no truck with, more serious versions of astrology where you might end up worshipping the stars.
Yeah.
Or regarding yourself as predetermined by a planetary constellation. So he set his face firmly against that. But he did believe that the heavens are telling the glory of God. Psalm 19. That was his favorite psalm, by the way. The heavens are telling the glory of God. The stars and the planets are not just large balls of rock and gas floating about above our heads. They have spiritual significance. They are angelic creatures, if you like, because they are telling the glory of God. They have a message to convey to us. So there is a spiritual component to the planets that we ought to pay attention to. And you find it in the Bible. Think of the wise men who follow the star to Bethlehem. The wise men from the east, they are astrologers, and their astrology leads them to worship Christ. So there's nothing necessarily wrong, foolish, or dangerous about astrological inquiry. It all depends what you do with it. So Lewis was an exponent, we might say, of Christian astrology, and there's a long tradition of that, not just in the Bible, but in church tradition. You find it discussed favorably by Augustine and John Chrysostom and up to the time of Aquinas. And it's we Christians, we modern Christians, who are out of step with our forebears when we tend to think of the stars as just, so much carbon and nitrogen and chemical constituents. That's not what stars are. There's a very interesting exchange in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader when Eustace says to the star character Ramandu, in our world a star is just a huge ball of flaming gas. And Ramandu replies and says, even in your world, my son, that is not what a star is, but only what it is made of. That's a beautifully simple encapsulation of Lewis's point, that in modern day thinking, we are reductively materialistic. Once we've established what the thing is made of, we think we've said all there is to be said about it. And that just ain't so.
Can't exhaust that mystery.
No.
I knew this would happen. I knew our time would slip by, and I knew I would have to warn you that I have goons in England who are willing to force you to come back in the future. It's just been delightful talking to you, Michael Ward. I love the book. And we didn't even get into your service to the British government under Her Majesty with your work with Q, handing implements to James Bond. But I'll explain that cryptic comment about your movie career. Are you still on the fringes of the acting world?
Yes, on the fringes.
Okay.
But as you see, I don't have much of a fringe.
Yes,
Have me back on some other time, and we can talk about all sorts of other interesting things.
And prayers for your vocation to the Catholic priesthood. I might add, our people would want to put you onto their prayer list as well. Thanks for writing the book. It's your work is a gift, and so are you, Michael. I've really enjoyed our time together.
Thanks, Patrick. It's been a blast. See you next time.
All right, terrific. What a good time, and what a great read. Before I say goodbye, I want to invite you to come to Italy. Next April 3rd through 12th, we're going to be in Assisi, Orvieto, Siena, Rome. We're going to be with the Holy Father for Divine Mercy Sunday. We're going to visit the top 4 main cathedrals in Rome. It's just going to be a bucket list trip of a lifetime. We really want you to come. If you pay by check, you save $130. Here's how to register. Sign up now. We're only taking one bus, okay? We're not going to do a multi-bus mega tour. This is a very close, intimate setting with friends you'll have for a lifetime. And here's how to connect. patrickcoffin.media/Italy. patrickcoffin.media/Italy. Sign up soon. Tickets are going, and we want you to be there, frankly. This is The Patrick Coffin Show. Be a saint. What else is there?